At 78 years old, I never imagined that the most devastating words I'd ever hear would come from the mouth of my own daughter during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner. What started as a simple family gathering to honor my late husband's birthday turned into the moment I discovered that the child I had sacrificed everything for saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience standing in the way of her plans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maria Elena Rodriguez, and for 6 decades, I've been the backbone of a family that built their success on my silent strength and unwavering devotion. When Sarah looked me in the eye that evening and called me a burden that was dragging down her future, I realized I was facing a betrayal so profound it would force me to choose between the family I'd created and the dignity I'd nearly lost along the way. The autumn evening in Denver carried that crisp bite that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with Colorado 45 years ago, when Eduardo and I first drove our beat-up Chevy across the state line, with everything we owned packed into the back seat and a dream of opening our own restaurant burning bright in our hearts. The golden leaves of the oak tree outside my kitchen window caught the last rays of sunlight as I put the finishing touches on the meal I'd been preparing since dawn, every dish a tribute to Eduardo's memory on what would have been his 80th birthday. I moved around my kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades turning simple ingredients into expressions of love. The mole poblano simmered on the stove, its complex blend of chocolate and chilies filling the house with the aroma that had once drawn customers from across Denver to our little restaurant. The tamales sat warming in their steamer, each one hand-rolled the way my mother had taught me in our tiny kitchen in Guadalajara so many years ago. Fresh tortillas waited under a clean dish towel, their warmth a comfort I'd provided for my family through every celebration and crisis for nearly 5 decades. This house had been our sanctuary, the 3-bedroom ranch-style home Eduardo and I had bought in 1985, when the restaurant finally became profitable enough for us to stop renting and start building something permanent. Every room held memories of the life we'd constructed together, from the living room where we'd celebrated Sarah's high school graduation to the back porch where Eduardo had taught our grandson Tommy to play guitar before the cancer took him 3 years ago. The walls were lined with photographs documenting our journey from struggling immigrants to successful business owners to proud grandparents. Eduardo and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful in our best clothes outside St. Joseph's Cathedral. Sarah taking her first steps in the restaurant's dining room, while we worked around her playpen. Tommy's Little League games, where Eduardo never missed a single inning despite the restaurant's demanding schedule. Family vacations to Rocky Mountain National Park. Christmas mornings filled with the chaos of unwrapping presents. Graduation ceremonies where 3 generations of Rodriguez women had walked across stages to claim diplomas that represented dreams achieved through determination and sacrifice. Tonight was supposed to add another memory to these walls. Sarah had suggested we gather to honor Eduardo's birthday, to share stories and keep his spirit alive through the traditions he'd loved most. She'd driven over from her house in the affluent Highlands neighborhood with her husband, Michael, and their twin daughters, Emma and Sophia, who at 15 had inherited their grandfather's love of music, but seemed increasingly uncomfortable in their grandmother's modest home. I had spent 3 days preparing Eduardo's favorite dishes, the same meal I'd cooked for him every year on his birthday since we were newlyweds sharing a 1-room apartment above a corner store. The table was set with our good china, the plates Eduardo had insisted we buy when the restaurant's success finally allowed us small luxuries. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Candles flickered in the dining room, casting warm shadows across the lace tablecloth my mother had sent from Mexico as a housewarming gift 40 years ago. Sarah arrived precisely at 6, her punctuality a trait she'd inherited from her father, along with his dark eyes and stubborn chin. At 47, she carried herself with the confident posture of someone who had transformed her parents' work ethic into corporate success, rising through the ranks of a major consulting firm to become a partner with a salary that dwarfed anything Eduardo and I had ever earned from our restaurant. She wore a tailored blazer that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, her hair styled in the sleek bob that had become her professional signature. Michael followed her into the house, his greeting warm but distracted as he immediately pulled out his phone to check emails. At 50, He'd grown soft around the middle, his success as a real estate developer evident in his expensive watch, and the luxury SUV parked in my driveway. He'd always treated me with polite respect, but I'd noticed over the years how his attention seemed to wander during family gatherings, as if he was mentally calculating the value of everything around him. Emma and Sophia entered with the reluctant energy of teenagers who'd been dragged away from more interesting activities. They hugged me dutifully, their embraces brief and perfunctory, before immediately asking if I had Wi-Fi strong enough for their various devices. I watched them settle into the living room with their phones, building walls of technology between themselves and the family stories they'd once begged to hear. As we gathered around the dining table, I felt Eduardo's absence like a physical ache. His chair at the head of the table remained empty, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had held our family together through his gentle strength and unwavering devotion to those he loved. I'd placed a small photograph of him next to his usual setting, the picture taken just months before his diagnosis, when his eyes still held the spark of someone planning decades of shared tomorrows. The conversation began pleasantly enough, Sarah asking about my health and my activities at the senior center, where I'd been volunteering since Eduardo's death. I told her about the literacy program I'd started, teaching elderly immigrants to read English, work that gave purpose to my days and honored Eduardo's memory by helping others achieve the dreams we'd once chased together. Michael nodded politely while cutting his mole-covered chicken into precise geometric pieces, his appreciation for my cooking evident even as his mind seemed elsewhere. As dinner progressed, I shared stories about Eduardo that I thought the girls should hear. Memories of their grandfather's generosity and wisdom that had shaped every decision we'd made as a family. I told them about the time Eduardo had given our last $100 to a family whose house had burned down, trusting that somehow we'd make rent that month through faith and hard work. I described his patient tutoring sessions with Sarah when she struggled with math in junior high, sitting at this same table night after night until she mastered concepts that would later help her excel in business school. But I noticed the girls' eyes glazing over as I spoke, their attention drifting to their phones despite Sarah's half-hearted attempts to encourage their participation. When I mentioned Eduardo's dream of passing the restaurant down through generations, keeping our family's recipes and traditions alive for future Rodriguez children and grandchildren, I saw something flicker across Sarah's face that I couldn't quite identify. Impatience, perhaps, or embarrassment at her children's obvious disengagement with their heritage. The shift in mood came when I began discussing my plans for Eduardo's recipes, my desire to compile them into a cookbook that could preserve our family's culinary history. I'd been working on this project for months, interviewing elderly women from our community about traditional techniques, researching the origins of dishes that connected us to our roots in Mexico. It was more than a cookbook, I explained to the table. It was a legacy project that could generate income for scholarships, helping young Hispanic students pursue culinary arts education. Sarah set down her fork with a precision that immediately put me on alert. The gesture was controlled, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had been building toward this moment throughout the evening. Michael's chewing slowed as he sensed the change in atmosphere, while the girls remained oblivious, lost in their digital worlds. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice carrying the patient tone she might use with a confused client, "we need to talk about your future plans." The word plans emerged with slight emphasis, as if my dreams were cute, but ultimately impractical notions that needed gentle correction from someone with superior understanding of reality. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm dining room. Something in Sarah's expression reminded me of the businesswoman she'd become, the person who made difficult decisions based on spreadsheets and profit margins rather than emotion or sentiment. This wasn't my daughter speaking, I realized. This was Sarah the consultant, analyzing a problem that needed efficient resolution. "What kind of plans?" I asked, setting down my own fork as my appetite suddenly disappeared. The mole that had tasted perfect moments before now seemed to coat my throat with an unpleasant thickness. Sarah exchanged a glance with Michael that spoke of conversations I hadn't been included in, decisions that had been made about my life without my input or knowledge. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless with the understanding that this dinner hadn't been planned to honor Eduardo's memory. It had been orchestrated to deliver news that would change everything. "Mom, you're 78 years old," Sarah began, her voice gentle but firm, as if she were explaining basic mathematics to a slow student. Living alone in this big house, trying to manage all these projects and responsibilities. It's becoming obvious that you're taking on more than you can handle. The words stung, but it was the pity in her voice that made my hands clench involuntarily in my lap. I had raised this woman, sacrificed my own dreams to ensure she had every opportunity to succeed, worked double shifts at the restaurant to pay for her college education, and now she was speaking to me as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about my own life. "I'm managing just fine," I said quietly, proud that my voice remained steady despite the storm building in my chest. "The house is maintained, my bills are paid, and my doctor says I'm in excellent health for my age." Michael cleared his throat, and I saw him and Sarah exchange another loaded glance. Whatever they had planned to discuss, they were moving into phase 2 of their presentation. The thought that my family meeting had been choreographed like a business proposal made my stomach turn with a mixture of hurt and growing anger. "That's not really the point, Maria," Michael said, using my first name with the familiarity of someone who thought he'd earned the right to make decisions about my life. "It's about being practical, about planning for the future before situations become unmanageable. Before situations become unmanageable." The phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to understand what situation they thought was spiraling out of control. I lived independently, drove my own car, managed my finances, maintained my home, and contributed to my community through volunteer work. What about my life suggested I was becoming unmanageable? Sarah leaned forward, her expression taking on the sympathetic but firm demeanor I remembered from her teenage years, when she thought she knew better than her parents about important matters. "Mom, we've been looking into some really nice assisted living communities. Places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this house, where you'd have built-in social activities and medical support nearby." The room seemed to tilt around me as the full meaning of her words sank in. They wanted to move me out of my home, the house Eduardo and I had bought together, where every room held memories of our life together, where I could still feel his presence in the morning light that streamed through our bedroom window, and the evening shadows that fell across his favorite reading chair. "Assisted living?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "You want to put me in a facility?" "It's not putting you anywhere, Mom," Sarah said quickly, her tone taking on the practiced patience of someone who had anticipated this resistance. "These are beautiful communities with wonderful amenities. Golf courses, swimming pools, organized trips, people your own age who share similar interests. People my own age who share similar interests." As if my interests were somehow limited by my age. As if the cookbook project, the literacy program, the community work that gave my days meaning were somehow inappropriate hobbies for someone approaching 80. "What about the restaurant recipes?" I asked, grasping for something concrete to anchor myself in this surreal conversation. "The cookbook project I've been working on?" Emma looked up from her phone for the first time during dinner, her teenage attention finally captured by what seemed to be developing into family drama. Sophia continued scrolling, but I could see her ears tuned to our conversation, waiting for entertainment value from what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. Sarah's expression grew more patient, more condescending, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I recognized the look she gave difficult clients before delivering unwelcome news. "Mom, that's exactly what we're talking about. These projects you've taken on, they're becoming obsessions that are taking over your life. It's not healthy for someone your age to be so focused on the past instead of enjoying the present." Obsessions. She called my work to preserve Eduardo's memory and our family's heritage an obsession. The literacy program that helped elderly immigrants navigate their new country became, in her corporate analysis, an unhealthy fixation on activities inappropriate for my age. The community connections I'd built over 60 years in Denver were apparently less valuable than the artificial social opportunities available in an assisted living facility. "These communities we're looking at," Michael added, pulling out his tablet to show me glossy photographs of manicured lawns and smiling elderly people engaged in activities that looked more like summer camp than real life. "They handle all the maintenance, all the household management, all the financial complexities that can become overwhelming as we age. As we age, not as I age, but as we age," as if my growing older was somehow a family burden that required collective management rather than individual dignity. I stared at the photographs on Michael's tablet. Images of elderly people playing shuffleboard and attending craft classes, their faces wearing the bright, empty smiles of people who had given up making meaningful choices about their own lives. Was this what Sarah envisioned for my future? Organized activities designed to fill time rather than serve purpose? Social interactions with strangers instead of the community relationships I'd spent decades building? How long have you been planning this? I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Sarah had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. We've been discussing options for a few months, ever since you mentioned wanting to expand the literacy program and start that cookbook project. Mom, we're worried about you taking on too much responsibility at your age. A few months. They had been planning my institutionalization for months without mentioning it to me, making decisions about my future, as if I were already too incompetent to participate in choices about my own life. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced, leaving me gasping for breath in my own dining room. What about this house? I managed to ask, looking around at the walls that held every significant memory of my adult life. Well, obviously it would need to be sold, Michael said with the casual efficiency of someone discussing a routine real estate transaction. The equity could be used to fund the assisted living arrangements, and honestly, the market is really strong right now for properties in established neighborhoods like this. Obviously, it would need to be sold. Eduardo's workshop in the garage where he'd built furniture for every room in our house. The garden where we'd grown vegetables for the restaurant and flowers for pure joy. The kitchen where I'd perfected recipes that had fed thousands of customers and countless family gatherings. The bedroom where Eduardo and I had shared 42 years of marriage, where he'd died peacefully in my arms just 3 years ago. All of it reduced to equity that could fund my removal from everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. The thing is, Mom, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a note I'd never heard before, something between impatience and frustration. You're becoming a burden. The word hit me like a physical slap, leaving me stunned and breathless. A burden. My daughter, the child I had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, supported through every crisis, and celebrated through every success, saw me as a burden. We have our own lives to manage, Sarah continued, apparently not noticing that her words had just shattered something fundamental inside me. Emma and Sophia are applying to colleges, which is incredibly expensive and competitive. Michael's business is expanding, which requires significant investment and attention. I'm up for senior partner, which means I can't be constantly worried about whether you're managing everything properly at your age. I sat in my dining room, surrounded by the meal I'd spent 3 days preparing to honor my husband's memory, listening to my daughter explain how my existence had become an obstacle to her family's prosperity and peace of mind. The candles I'd lit flickered across faces that had become those of strangers. People who saw my love as obligation and my presence as inconvenience. You're saying I'm a burden, I repeated, needing to hear the words clearly to believe she had actually spoken them. I'm saying it's time to be realistic about the future, Sarah replied, but she couldn't meet my eyes as she spoke. It's time to make practical decisions that work for everyone involved. Everyone involved. Except the person whose life was being dismantled for the convenience of others. The silence that followed stretched across the dinner table like a chasm, broken only by the quiet sounds of Emma and Sophia whispering to each other about the family drama unfolding in front of them. I could see them filming snippets on their phones, turning my heartbreak into content for their social media feeds. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and tried to find traces of the little girl who used to help me roll masa for tortillas, who had cried when her goldfish died and begged me to hold her until she felt better, who had called me her best friend during her elementary school years when other children's cruelty made her doubt her worth. That little girl was gone, replaced by a woman who could calculate the financial and emotional costs of caring for an aging parent, and determined that institutionalizing me was the most efficient solution to the problem my continued independence presented. I stood up from the table slowly, my legs shaking with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Rage, grief, and something else, something harder and colder, that was crystallizing in my chest, like ice forming on a winter window. I think, I said quietly, this dinner is over. Sarah looked up in surprise, clearly expecting more resistance, more emotional pleading, more of the helpless confusion she'd apparently been counting on to make her proposal seem reasonable and necessary. "Mom, we don't have to decide anything tonight," she said quickly. "Why don't you think about what we've discussed, maybe visit some of the communities we've researched? You might be surprised by how much you'd enjoy the lifestyle." The lifestyle. As if being warehoused with other elderly people whose families had decided they were too inconvenient to love was a lifestyle choice, rather than a surrender of everything that made life worth living. "I don't need to think about it," I said, moving to the front door with a dignity I'd thought was lost forever. "I need you to leave." Michael stood up first, clearly recognizing that the evening hadn't gone according to their carefully planned script. "Maria, maybe we should all take a step back and approach this conversation differently next week." Next week. They thought this was a negotiation that would continue over multiple sessions until they wore down my resistance and convinced me to accept their solution to the problem of my existence. "There won't be a next week," I said, opening the front door and stepping aside to let them pass. "There won't be any more conversations about my future unless I initiate them." Emma and Sophia gathered their phones and jackets. With the practiced efficiency of teenagers accustomed to leaving family gatherings that had become uncomfortable, they hugged me goodbye with the same perfunctory affection they'd shown when arriving, as if nothing significant had happened, as if their grandmother's life hadn't just been casually dismantled over dessert. Sarah paused in the doorway, her expression a mixture of frustration and what might have been regret. "Mom, I hope you'll think about what we discussed. We really do want what's best for you." "What's best for me?" As if she had any understanding of what brought joy, purpose, and meaning to my days. As if the woman who had built a business, raised a family, and contributed to her community for 6 decades was somehow incapable of determining what circumstances would support her continued happiness and dignity. After they left, I stood in my quiet house, surrounded by the remnants of the dinner I'd prepared with such hope and love. The candles still flickered on the table, Eduardo's photograph still smiled from his empty place setting, and the dishes still waited to be cleared away like evidence of the evening's devastating revelation. I walked through my home, seeing it with new eyes, understanding for the first time how Sarah and Michael viewed these rooms, not as the sanctuary Eduardo and I had created together, but as a burden requiring maintenance, a responsibility consuming resources that could be better invested in their children's future. The kitchen where I'd taught Sarah to cook her grandmother's recipes now seemed, from their perspective, like a dangerous space where an elderly woman might injure herself. The garden Eduardo and I had tended together became, in their analysis, a maintenance obligation beyond my physical capabilities. The workshop where Eduardo had built furniture with his own hands transformed into a liability insurance nightmare waiting to happen. Every photograph on the walls, every piece of furniture Eduardo had crafted, every corner where we'd shared quiet moments and important conversations became, through Sarah's corporate lens, clutter that needed efficient disposal so the property could be prepared for sale. But as I moved through these rooms, I felt something else growing alongside my grief and anger. A steely determination that had carried me through immigration, poverty, business challenges, and personal loss was awakening with a clarity I hadn't experienced since Eduardo's death. Tomorrow morning I would call my lawyer. I woke the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt since Eduardo's funeral, my mind sharp despite having barely slept 3 hours. The hurt from Sarah's words still burned in my chest like acid, but something else had crystallized during the long, dark hours I'd spent staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd shared with my husband for 4 decades. A cold, calculated anger that reminded me of the woman who had once stood up to predatory landlords, fought discriminatory bank loan officers, and built a successful business in a country that hadn't always welcomed people like us. I sat on the edge of our bed, Eduardo's side still perfectly made the way I'd kept it since his death, and reached for the small wooden box on my nightstand, where I kept his wedding ring and the business cards of people who had mattered in our life together. My fingers found the card I was looking for immediately, as if I'd been preparing for this moment without realizing it. David Martinez, attorney at law, the man who had handled Eduardo's will and had been telling me for 3 years that I needed to update my own estate planning. The irony wasn't lost on me that the daughter who wanted to institutionalize me had no idea about the true scope of what Eduardo and I had built together. Sarah knew about the restaurant, of course, and she knew we'd been comfortable enough to pay for her education and help with her first house down payment. But she'd never shown interest in the details of our business dealings, the property investments Eduardo had made with such careful foresight, or the life insurance policies and retirement accounts that had grown substantially over decades of disciplined saving. During our 42 years of marriage, Eduardo had been the public face of our success while I managed the financial foundation that made everything possible. I'd been the one who negotiated with suppliers, managed payroll, tracked inventory, and invested our profits in the real estate ventures that had quietly made us wealthy by most people's standards. Eduardo got the credit for our restaurant's success, but I had been the business mind that turned his culinary dreams into sustainable prosperity. The morning light streaming through my bedroom windows illuminated the framed photograph of Eduardo and me taken on our 35th wedding anniversary, both of us standing in front of the restaurant with pride radiating from our faces like sunlight. We'd worked 16-hour days for decades to build something lasting, something we could pass down to future generations. Now my own daughter wanted to liquidate that legacy to fund my removal from the life we'd created together. I showered and dressed with the same care I'd once taken when preparing for important business meetings, choosing the navy blue suit Eduardo had bought me for our restaurant's 20th anniversary celebration. It still fit perfectly, a testament to the active lifestyle I maintained, despite Sarah's apparent belief that my age had made me fragile and incapable. As I prepared my morning coffee, using the expensive espresso machine Eduardo had installed in our kitchen during the restaurant's most profitable years, I allowed myself to remember the conversation I'd overheard 2 weeks ago, when Sarah thought I was napping in the living room. She'd been on the phone with Michael, their voices carrying clearly through the thin walls of my house as they discussed their concerns about my, quote, situation. "She's becoming increasingly isolated," Sarah had said, her tone carrying the clinical detachment she used when analyzing problem clients. "Spending too much time alone in that house, getting obsessed with these projects that don't really matter to anyone but her. It's not healthy for someone her age to be so focused on the past." Michael's response had been equally clinical. "The property is worth at least $400,000 in this market, maybe more if we did some updating before listing it. That would cover a nice assisted living facility for years, and we wouldn't have to worry about maintenance issues or emergency calls in the middle of the night. Emergency calls in the middle of the night. As if I were some kind of medical crisis waiting to happen, rather than a healthy 78-year-old woman who walked 3 miles every morning, maintained her own home, and contributed actively to her community. But it was Sarah's next comment that had truly opened my eyes to how my daughter viewed my continued independence. "The thing is, Michael, she's holding on to control over assets that could be better managed by people who understand modern financial strategies. That restaurant property alone is probably worth twice what she thinks it is, and she's letting it sit there generating minimal income when it could be developed into something much more profitable." That restaurant property. The building that housed Rodriguez Family Kitchen, the business Eduardo and I had built from nothing, had become, in Sarah's analysis, an underperforming asset that needed more sophisticated management. Never mind that the restaurant continued to operate successfully under the management team we'd carefully trained. Never mind that it provided steady income and employed 15 people who had become like family to us over the years. Sarah saw only numbers on a balance sheet, potential profits being left on the table by an elderly woman too sentimental to make smart business decisions. I'd pretended to continue napping, listening as they discussed my financial situation, with the casual precision of accountants reviewing a client's portfolio. They knew about the restaurant and the house, but they had no idea about the additional properties Eduardo and I had acquired over the years. The small apartment building we'd purchased in the late 1980s that now generated substantial rental income. The commercial property we'd bought during the 2008 recession, when other investors were panicking. The carefully managed investment accounts that had grown steadily under the guidance of our financial advisor, who still called me monthly to discuss market conditions and strategy adjustments. Sarah and Michael thought they were planning the institutionalization of a confused elderly woman with limited resources who needed their protection and management. They had no idea they were plotting against someone who had been making sophisticated financial decisions since before Sarah was born. I finished my coffee and walked through my house one more time, seeing it not as the burden Sarah had described, but as the carefully maintained expression of a life well lived. Every piece of furniture told a story. The dining room set Eduardo had built by hand during our 3rd year in Denver, when we couldn't afford to buy decent furniture but refused to live without dignity. The hand-woven rugs I'd purchased directly from artisans during our trips back to Mexico, supporting traditional crafts while beautifying our home. The kitchen appliances that had been upgraded gradually as our success allowed us small luxuries that made daily life more pleasant. This house wasn't just a structure requiring maintenance. It was the physical manifestation of dreams achieved through decades of sacrifice and hard work. Every room represented choices Eduardo and I had made together, priorities we'd established, values we'd expressed through how we chose to live. But more than that, it was the anchor that kept me connected to the community I'd helped build over 60 years in Denver. Mrs. Patterson next door, who brought me soup when I was sick and relied on me to water her plants when she visited her grandchildren. Father Rodriguez at St. Joseph's, who still called me for advice about parishioners struggling with immigration issues. The women in my literacy program, who trusted me with their dreams of reading English well enough to help their own grandchildren with homework. Sarah's assisted living facility would strip me of these connections, replacing meaningful relationships with organized activities designed to keep elderly residents occupied rather than engaged. I would become just another participant in someone else's schedule, rather than a contributor to a community that valued my knowledge and experience. The phone call to David Martinez was answered on the 2nd ring, his familiar voice bringing immediate comfort during what felt like the most isolating morning of my life. David had been Eduardo's friend before he became our lawyer, a relationship that began when he was a young attorney struggling to establish his practice, and we were restaurant owners who needed legal help we could actually afford. "Maria," David said warmly, "I was just thinking about you yesterday. How are you holding up?" The simple kindness in his voice nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. David had been one of the few people who understood the depth of my partnership with Eduardo, who recognized that I'd been the business brain behind our restaurant's success, even when social conventions required Eduardo to take credit as the man of the family. "I need to see you today if possible," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the emotional storm raging in my chest. "I think it's time we discussed updating my estate planning." There was a pause, and I could hear David's professional instincts engaging. As someone who specialized in family law and estate planning, he'd probably heard that particular tone of voice before, the sound of someone who had discovered they needed protection from their own relatives. "Of course," he said carefully. "Is everything all right, Maria? You sound like something specific has happened." I closed my eyes, gathering the strength to say the words that would make Sarah's betrayal real and irreversible. "My daughter wants to put me in assisted living. She called me a burden last night and outlined her plans to sell my house and liquidate my assets to fund my institutionalization." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When David finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled anger of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by greed masquerading as concern. "How much does Sarah know about your actual financial situation?" he asked, and I could hear him pulling out paperwork, preparing to take notes. "Very little," I admitted. "She knows about the restaurant and this house, but she doesn't know about the other properties or the investment accounts." Eduardo always handled discussions about money with the children, and after he died, I just continued paying the bills and managing things quietly. "Maria, I need you to listen to me very carefully," David said, his tone carrying the urgency of someone delivering crucial information. "Based on what you've told me, it sounds like Sarah may be planning to petition for guardianship, possibly claiming that you're no longer capable of managing your own affairs. In Colorado, adult children can initiate competency proceedings if they can demonstrate that a parent poses a danger to themselves through poor financial or personal decisions." The words hit me like ice water, making me suddenly understand the true scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about Sarah's preference for my living situation. This was about legal control over my life, my assets, and my autonomy as an adult human being. "Can she do that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She can try," David said grimly. "And if she has evidence of what she could characterize as eccentric behavior, social isolation, or questionable financial decisions, she might convince a judge that guardianship is necessary for your protection." The cookbook project you mentioned to me could be twisted into evidence of obsessive behavior. Your volunteer work could be presented as confusion about appropriate activities for someone your age. Even your independence could be characterized as dangerous isolation that puts you at risk. I felt the room spinning around me as I realized how thoroughly Sarah had been preparing for this. Every conversation about my activities, every expression of concern about my health, every suggestion that I might be taking on too much responsibility had been building toward this moment when she would present herself as the loving daughter, trying to protect a confused elderly mother from her own poor judgment. "What can I do?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "First, we document everything," David said, his voice taking on the crisp efficiency I remembered from the business meetings, where he'd helped Eduardo and me navigate complex legal challenges. "I want a complete medical evaluation from your doctor confirming your mental and physical competency. I want financial records showing that you've been managing your affairs responsibly. I want character references from people who interact with you regularly and can testify to your capability and judgment. And then we make sure your estate planning is bulletproof," David said. "We establish powers of attorney that you control, medical directives that reflect your actual wishes, and asset protection strategies that prevent anyone from liquidating your wealth without your explicit consent. We make it legally impossible for Sarah to do what she's planning, even if she somehow convinced a court that guardianship was necessary." I walked to the window overlooking the garden Eduardo and I had planted together, seeing the roses we'd tended for 30 years blooming in defiant beauty despite the autumn chill. Those roses had survived harsh winters, drought, disease, and neglect, always returning stronger and more beautiful each spring. Like Eduardo and me, they'd endured because they were rooted in something deeper than surface conditions. "David," I said, watching a hummingbird hover over the late-blooming flowers, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something I haven't shared with Sarah or anyone else since Eduardo died." "What is it, Maria?" I took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the secret Eduardo and I had kept for over a decade, the financial security we'd built that would make Sarah's plans not just morally wrong, but completely unnecessary from a practical standpoint. "Eduardo and I didn't just own the restaurant and this house," I said slowly. "We own 4 other properties in Denver, including the apartment building where we got our start. We have investment accounts worth more than Sarah's annual salary. We established a charitable foundation that's been quietly funding scholarships for Hispanic students for 8 years. Eduardo left me wealth that most people would consider a small fortune." The silence on David's end of the line was deafening. "Maria," he said finally, "how much are we talking about?" "Approximately $2.5 million in total assets," I said, the numbers feeling strange in my mouth after years of keeping Eduardo's financial privacy, not including the foundation accounts, which hold another $400,000. "And Sarah doesn't know any of this?" "Sarah knows we were comfortable, but she has no idea about the true scope of what Eduardo built. She thinks she's planning the care of an elderly woman with limited resources who needs her help. She doesn't realize she's plotting to steal a fortune from someone who could probably buy her house for cash without straining my budget." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically hear his legal mind processing the implications of what I'd just revealed. "Maria, this changes everything," he said finally. "Sarah isn't just trying to control an elderly parent she thinks can't manage her own affairs. If she's planning to liquidate your assets and place you in an institution, she could be committing elder abuse and financial exploitation on a massive scale." The words hung in the air between us, making real what I'd been trying not to acknowledge since last night's dinner. My daughter wasn't just misguided or overly concerned about my welfare. She was planning to commit crimes against me, using my age and her position as my child to justify theft disguised as caregiving. "What do we do now?" I asked, surprised by how calm I felt despite the magnitude of what we were discussing. "Now we protect you," David said with quiet determination. "And we make sure Sarah understands exactly what she's trying to take before she makes choices that could destroy your relationship forever and land her in serious legal trouble." As I hung up the phone, I felt Eduardo's presence in the kitchen, where we'd shared thousands of morning conversations about business decisions, family concerns, and dreams for the future. He'd always trusted my judgment about people and situations, relying on my instincts when his generous heart made him too willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. Eduardo would have been heartbroken by Sarah's betrayal, but he would have supported whatever action I decided to take to protect myself and preserve the legacy we'd built together. He'd always believed that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all, but enablement that ultimately harmed everyone involved. The appointment with David was scheduled for that afternoon, but first I had other calls to make. Dr. Patricia Williams, my primary care physician, needed to provide documentation of my competency. Father Rodriguez needed to understand what was happening so he could serve as a character witness if necessary. The manager of my literacy program needed to know that my volunteer activities might become evidence in a legal proceeding. But most importantly, I needed to drive by the restaurant and see Eduardo's legacy with fresh eyes, understanding for the first time how much I had to protect and how far Sarah was willing to go to take it away from me. The morning that had begun with devastating clarity was about to become something much more complex and dangerous. Sarah thought she was managing the decline of a confused elderly woman. She was about to discover she'd declared war on a formidable opponent who had been fighting for family and financial security since long before Sarah was born. The real battle for my dignity, my independence, and Eduardo's legacy was just beginning. The drive to Rodriguez family kitchen took me through neighborhoods that held the entire history of my life in Denver, each street corner marking another chapter in the story Eduardo and I had written together. As I turned onto Colfax Avenue, I passed the small apartment where we'd lived during our first year in Colorado, the building now renovated into trendy condos that young professionals could barely afford. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sarah wanted to institutionalize the woman who had helped gentrify this entire area through decades of business investment and community involvement. I parked across the street from our restaurant, studying the building with eyes that had been opened by David's warnings about guardianship proceedings and financial exploitation. What I saw was a thriving business that anchored its entire block, drawing customers from across the metro area who came for authentic Mexican cuisine prepared with recipes that had been perfected over generations. The lunch crowd was already forming, a mix of construction workers, office employees, and families who trusted Rodriguez Family Kitchen to provide both excellent food and fair prices. But I also saw what Sarah and Michael would see when they evaluated this property for its development potential. Prime real estate in a rapidly appreciating neighborhood, with parking that could accommodate a much larger structure, zoning that would permit mixed-use development, and a location that would appeal to the young professionals moving into downtown Denver. In their calculation, my sentimental attachment to the restaurant was an obstacle preventing the maximization of a valuable asset. Rosa Morales, our manager for the past 12 years, spotted me through the front window and hurried outside to greet me with the warm embrace that had become ritual whenever I visited. At 55, Rosa carried herself with the confident authority of someone who had learned the restaurant business from the ground up, starting as a server when her English was limited, and gradually becoming the operational backbone that allowed Eduardo and me to step back from daily management during his final years. "Señora Maria," Rosa said, her voice carrying genuine pleasure at seeing me, "you look beautiful today. Special occasion?" I studied Rosa's face, seeing not just an employee, but a woman whose family I had supported through immigration challenges, whose children I had helped with college applications, whose mother I had visited in the hospital when cancer threatened to take another person we loved too soon. Rosa represented the extended family Eduardo and I had created through our business, relationships that went far deeper than employment contracts or profit margins. "Rosa, I need to ask you something important," I said, my voice carrying a seriousness that immediately focused her attention. If someone questioned whether I was still capable of making good decisions about my life, what would you tell them? Rosa's eyebrows drew together in confusion and concern. "Señora, who would question such a thing? You are one of the sharpest people I know. Just last month you caught that accounting error our bookkeeper missed, and you're always thinking 3 steps ahead about everything from menu planning to staff scheduling." Her response provided exactly the kind of evidence David had said we would need if Sarah actually pursued guardianship proceedings. Rosa had worked closely with me for over a decade, observing my decision-making process and business judgment on a regular basis. Her testimony about my competency would carry weight with any court that might consider whether I needed protection from my own choices. "Rosa, I need you to document our interactions over the next few weeks," I said carefully. "Keep notes about conversations we have, decisions I make, problems I help solve. There may come a time when your observations about my mental capacity become very important." The worry in Rosa's expression deepened as she began to understand that I was facing some kind of threat to my independence. "Señora, is this about your daughter? Because I have to tell you, the last time she was here, she asked strange questions about whether you still understand the business, whether you sometimes seem confused about details you used to handle easily." My blood chilled as I realized Sarah had been building her case for months, questioning people in my life to gather evidence that could support claims about my declining competency. The daughter who rarely visited the restaurant had apparently made multiple recent appearances, not to check on our family business, but to collect ammunition for her planned assault on my autonomy. "What exactly did she ask?" I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. Rosa looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing she didn't have to repeat conversations that had made her uneasy at the time. "She wanted to know if you still review the monthly financial reports, if you ever seem confused about supplier contracts or employee issues. She asked whether you've been making unusual decisions or talking about unrealistic plans for the future." Each question revealed the sophistication of Sarah's strategy. She wasn't just planning to present me as generally incompetent, but was building a specific case about financial confusion and poor business judgment that would justify removing me from control of all my assets, not just my personal care decisions. "Did you tell her anything that could be misinterpreted?" I asked, already knowing that Rosa's honest answers about my continued involvement in restaurant operations could be twisted to support Sarah's narrative. "I told her you still review everything carefully and catch details the rest of us miss," Rosa said defensively. "But she seemed more interested in times when you've talked about expanding the scholarship program or funding community projects. She kept asking if those seemed like realistic goals or if they worried me as signs that you might be losing track of practical limitations. My community involvement and charitable interests, the activities that gave my retirement meaning and purpose, were being characterized as evidence of impaired judgment." Sarah was preparing to argue that my generosity and social engagement were symptoms of cognitive decline, rather than expressions of values Eduardo and I had always shared. I spent an hour at the restaurant, ostensibly reviewing routine paperwork but actually documenting my continued involvement in business operations. I met with our head chef about menu modifications for the winter season, discussed marketing strategies with Rosa, and reviewed employee schedules to ensure adequate coverage during the busy holiday period. Every interaction provided evidence of my mental acuity and business competence that could counter Sarah's claims about my declining capacity. But more importantly, my visit reminded me of what I was really fighting to protect. This restaurant wasn't just a financial asset generating rental income from our management team. It was the heart of a community that Eduardo and I had helped create, a gathering place where 3 generations of families celebrated milestones and weathered crises together. The walls held photographs documenting decades of quinceañeras, wedding receptions, graduation parties, and memorial services that had brought people together around food prepared with love and respect for tradition. Sarah's plan to liquidate this property for development would destroy something irreplaceable, scatter a community that had taken decades to build, eliminate jobs for people who had become family to us. Her focus on maximizing financial returns ignored the social and cultural value that couldn't be measured in dollars but represented Eduardo's true legacy. My next stop was Dr. Patricia Williams' office, where I needed medical documentation that would counter any claims about my physical or mental decline. Dr. Williams had been my physician for 15 years, monitoring my health through Eduardo's illness and death, helping me navigate the challenges of aging while maintaining my independence and activity level. The receptionist, familiar with my regular visits for preventative care, greeted me warmly and immediately accommodated my request for an urgent appointment. Within 30 minutes, I was sitting in Dr. Williams' office, explaining the threats Sarah's plans posed to my autonomy and well-being. Dr. Williams listened with the focused attention she brought to all serious medical discussions, but I could see anger building in her expression as I described Sarah's characterization of my lifestyle as dangerous, and her plans to institutionalize me, despite my excellent health and mental acuity. "Maria, you're one of my healthiest patients," Dr. Williams said firmly. "Your blood pressure is well controlled, your cholesterol levels are excellent, your cognitive function tests consistently show results typical of someone 20 years younger. You walk 3 miles daily, maintain a healthy weight, manage your medications responsibly, and engage in regular social activities that support mental health." She pulled out my chart, documenting the evidence that would counter any suggestion that I needed institutional care or couldn't make responsible decisions about my own welfare. "Your last comprehensive evaluation showed no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair your judgment. You scored in the 95th percentile on memory and reasoning tests." "But could Sarah convince a court that I need guardianship?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since my conversation with David. Dr. Williams considered the question carefully, her expression reflecting the professional concern of someone who had seen too many competent elderly patients lose their autonomy to family members more interested in convenience than genuine care. "Unfortunately, guardianship proceedings often focus more on age and family convenience than actual medical necessity," she said honestly. "If Sarah can present herself as a concerned daughter worried about an elderly mother living alone, and if she can characterize your community activities as evidence of poor judgment or social isolation, she might find a sympathetic court." The honesty in Dr. Williams' response was both frightening and valuable. I needed to understand the real scope of the threat I was facing, not receive false reassurance that would leave me unprepared for Sarah's next moves. "What can you do to help protect me?" I asked. "I can provide comprehensive medical documentation of your competency, including detailed cognitive assessments that would be difficult for any court to dismiss," Dr. Williams said. "I can also testify, if necessary, about your ability to make informed decisions about your healthcare and living situation. But Maria, the most important thing you can do is maintain detailed records of your daily activities, financial management, and social interactions that demonstrate your continued capability." Before leaving Dr. Williams' office, I scheduled comprehensive cognitive and physical evaluations for the following week, creating a paper trail that would make it nearly impossible for Sarah to claim I was hiding declining capacity or avoiding medical oversight of my condition. The afternoon brought me to St. Joseph's Cathedral, where Father Rodriguez was preparing for evening mass in the sanctuary where Eduardo and I had worshipped for over 40 years. The familiar scent of candles and incense provided comfort during what felt like the most spiritually challenging day I'd experienced since Eduardo's death. Father Rodriguez, now in his 70s but still carrying himself with the dignified bearing that had made him a respected leader in Denver's Hispanic community, embraced me with the warmth reserved for parishioners who had become genuine friends over decades of shared faith and service. "Maria, you look troubled," he said, his perceptive eyes reading the stress I'd been trying to hide behind professional composure. "What brings you here on a weekday afternoon?" In the quiet privacy of his office, surrounded by photographs documenting his 50 years of ministry to immigrant families like ours, I explained Sarah's plans and the legal vulnerability David had identified. Father Rodriguez listened with the patient attention he brought to all confessions and counseling sessions, but I could see his disapproval growing as I described my daughter's willingness to institutionalize me for financial convenience. "This breaks my heart, Maria," Father Rodriguez said when I finished my account. "Sarah received her first communion in this church. Eduardo and I talked for hours about his hopes for her future, his dreams that she would carry forward the values you had taught her about family loyalty and respect for elders." His words reminded me of conversations I'd tried to forget, moments when Eduardo had worried that our success might insulate Sarah from the struggles that had shaped our character and values. He'd feared that financial security might make her children take family sacrifices for granted, viewing inherited wealth as entitlement rather than responsibility. "Father, I need your help documenting my mental competency and community involvement," I said, explaining David's strategy for building a defense against guardianship proceedings. "Of course," Father Rodriguez said without hesitation. "You coordinate our immigrant literacy program, manage the scholarship fund for Catholic school students, organize our annual cultural celebration that brings together thousands of families. Your contributions to this parish and this community are immeasurable." But then his expression grew more serious, reflecting concerns that went beyond my immediate legal vulnerability. "Maria, I must ask you something difficult. Is it possible that Sarah genuinely believes she's acting in your best interests? Could her plans stem from misguided love rather than malicious greed? The question forced me to confront the possibility I'd been avoiding since last night's devastating dinner. Was Sarah's betrayal motivated by selfish convenience? Or had I somehow failed to demonstrate my continued competency in ways that genuinely worried her about my welfare? "Father, she called me a burden," I said quietly. "She discussed my assets as if they were already hers to manage. She made plans for my institutionalization without consulting me about my preferences or concerns. Even if her motivations include genuine worry, her methods show fundamental disrespect for my dignity and autonomy." Father Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the validity of my concerns, while maintaining the pastoral balance that allowed him to see good intentions even in harmful actions. "I will provide whatever documentation and testimony you need," he assured me, "but I also encourage you to pray for Sarah, to consider whether there might be ways to address her concerns without destroying your relationship permanently." His suggestion reflected the forgiveness and reconciliation that formed the foundation of our shared faith, but it also highlighted the spiritual dimension of the choice I was facing. Did protecting myself from Sarah's plans require destroying our relationship entirely? Or was there a way to defend my autonomy while leaving room for eventual healing? As evening approached, I drove through the neighborhoods where I'd built relationships over 6 decades in Denver, seeing my community with new appreciation for the connections that gave my life meaning and purpose. Mrs. Anderson, the widow who relied on my weekly grocery shopping assistance since her hip surgery. The Martinez family, whose teenage daughter I'd been tutoring in English and college application writing. The senior center where my literacy program served 30 elderly immigrants who were learning to read English so they could help their grandchildren with homework. These relationships represented the social fabric that Sarah wanted to tear away from me in the name of providing appropriate activities with people my own age. But the people my own age in assisted living facilities were strangers who had lost their own communities, their own purposes, their own reasons for getting up each morning with enthusiasm rather than resignation. I stopped at the small market where Eduardo and I had shopped for restaurant supplies during our early years, now run by the son of the original owner who still gave me the family discount in recognition of our decades of loyalty. Carlos Vega Jr. had grown up in this store, watching his father build relationships with customers who became extended family, learning business practices based on trust and mutual respect rather than pure profit maximization. "Señora Rodriguez," Carlos said warmly, "how can I help you today?" I realized that this simple interaction represented everything Sarah's plans would destroy. Carlos knew my preferences, my history, my connection to this community. In an assisted living facility, I would be just another resident to staff members who rotated shifts and followed institutional protocols rather than building personal relationships. "Carlos, I need to ask you a favor," I said, explaining my need for character witnesses who could testify about my mental acuity and continued competency. "Of course," Carlos said immediately. "Anyone who questions your sharpness has never seen you negotiate with suppliers or catch pricing errors that even my computerized systems miss. Just last month you helped me resolve that billing dispute with the produce distributor that could have cost me thousands of dollars." His willingness to support me reflected the community loyalty that Eduardo and I had built through decades of treating business relationships as human connections rather than mere transactions. These people would stand up for me not just because I asked them to, but because I had proven my worth to them through consistent action over many years. By the time I returned home that evening, I had assembled a network of support that would make Sarah's plans much more difficult to execute. Medical professionals who could document my competency. Community leaders who could testify about my continued contributions and mental acuity. Business associates who could verify my financial judgment and decision-making abilities. But I had also gained something else that felt equally valuable. A clear understanding of what I was really fighting to protect. This wasn't just about money or property or legal autonomy, though all of those mattered. This was about the right to live a life of purpose and dignity, to maintain connections that had been built over decades, to continue contributing to a community that valued my experience and wisdom. Sarah's assisted living facility might provide safety and convenience, but it couldn't replace the meaning that came from being needed, respected, and genuinely useful to people who mattered to me. Her plans would preserve my physical comfort while destroying everything that made my continued existence worthwhile. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt Eduardo's presence more strongly than I had since his death, as if he were standing beside me during this crisis, the way he'd supported me through every other challenge we'd faced together. His voice seemed to whisper the words he'd always used when we confronted difficult decisions. Amor, we didn't come this far to surrender now. We fight for what matters, and we fight together. Tomorrow would bring my appointment with David Martinez, where we would begin building the legal fortress that would protect everything Eduardo and I had created together. Sarah thought she was planning the manageable decline of a helpless elderly woman. She was about to discover she had declared war on someone who had been fighting for family, dignity, and financial security since long before she was born. The real battle for my independence was about to begin, and I intended to win. The morning of the confrontation arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes with Denver's high-altitude autumn air, sharp and clean and unforgiving of any attempt to hide behind illusions or half-truths. I had chosen this day deliberately, exactly 1 week after Sarah's devastating dinner, giving myself time to prepare while the wound was still fresh enough to fuel my determination. As I dressed in the charcoal gray suit Eduardo had helped me select for our restaurant's 25th anniversary celebration, I felt his presence surrounding me like armor, his quiet strength flowing through my veins as I prepared for the most important battle of my life. The living room had been transformed into a courtroom of sorts, though I suspected Sarah would never understand the trial she was about to face. David Martinez sat in Eduardo's favorite armchair, his briefcase open beside him like a general's battle plans. Documents arranged with military precision across the coffee table that had once held birthday cakes and Christmas presents, and all the ordinary celebrations of a loving family. Father Rodriguez occupied the sofa, his presence lending moral weight to what could have been dismissed as a mere family squabble. Dr. Patricia Williams had positioned herself near the window, her medical bag and folders of documentation serving as silent testimony to my competency and health. But it was the final member of our assembled group who would deliver the most devastating blow to Sarah's carefully constructed narrative. Detective Carmen Ruiz from the Denver Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit sat quietly in the corner, her badge and uniform making clear that this had moved far beyond family disagreement into potential criminal territory. David had insisted on her presence after reviewing the evidence of Sarah's systematic investigation into my affairs, her conversations with my business associates, and her apparent coordination with Michael to plan the liquidation of assets that weren't legally theirs to control. I had positioned myself facing the front door, wanting to see Sarah's expression the moment she realized this wasn't the follow-up conversation she'd been expecting. The morning light streaming through my curtains illuminated the family photographs that lined the mantelpiece, Eduardo and me with baby Sarah, family vacations and graduations, and all the moments of joy that had built the foundation Sarah was now trying to destroy for her own convenience. The sound of her key in the lock sent electricity through the assembled group, though everyone maintained their positions, with the discipline of people who understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Sarah's voice carried from the entryway, bright and confident as she called out to me with the patronizing cheerfulness she'd been using since deciding I was too incompetent to manage my own life. "Mom, I brought those brochures I mentioned," Sarah announced as she entered the living room, her words dying in her throat as she took in the unexpected assembly of people waiting for her. Michael appeared behind her, his expression shifting from casual confidence to wary confusion as he recognized the formal nature of what they'd walked into. The silence stretched across the room like a taut wire, broken only by the quiet sound of Sarah's purse hitting the floor as her grip loosened in shock. I watched her face cycle through emotions too quickly to catalog, confusion giving way to alarm, giving way to something that looked almost like panic, as she began to understand that her carefully laid plans had somehow been discovered and countered. "Mom," Sarah said slowly, her voice carrying none of the assured authority she'd displayed during our dinner conversation. "What's going on here? Who are all these people?" I felt Eduardo's strength flowing through me as I stood, my spine straight with the dignity that no one could take away unless I chose to surrender it. The woman who had built a successful business from nothing, who had raised a family while managing complex financial affairs, who had contributed to her community for 6 decades, was finally ready to defend herself against the daughter who had forgotten where her own success had originated. "Sarah," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority I'd once used to negotiate with difficult suppliers and handle restaurant crises. These people are here because you forced me to protect myself from your plans to steal my independence, my home, and my assets under the guise of concern for my welfare. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each accusation landing with precision born of careful preparation and righteous anger. Michael stepped protectively closer to his wife, his businessman's instincts recognizing a hostile negotiation, even if he didn't yet understand the specific charges being leveled against them. That's ridiculous, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction, carrying the hollow ring of someone defending a position she knew was morally indefensible. We were trying to help you plan for your future, to make sure you're safe and properly cared for. David Martinez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the professional authority that had made him one of Denver's most respected family attorneys. Sarah, I'm David Martinez, your mother's legal counsel. We need to discuss the legal implications of your recent activities regarding your mother's financial affairs and living situation. The mention of legal implications caused Michael's face to pale noticeably, his real estate developer's experience with litigation, making him immediately aware that they were facing something far more serious than family drama. Sarah's eyes darted between the assembled faces, finally landing on Detective Ruiz's uniform with an expression approaching terror. This is Detective Carmen Ruiz from the Denver Police Elder Abuse Unit, David continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the nuclear bomb he was dropping into Sarah's carefully constructed world. She's here because your mother's situation may constitute attempted financial exploitation and abuse of a vulnerable adult. The legal terminology hit Sarah like a cold slap, stripping away the comfortable narrative that had allowed her to characterize her plans as loving concern rather than criminal conspiracy. Michael's hand found her arm, both supporting and restraining her as the reality of their situation began to penetrate his business-focused mind. Financial exploitation? Sarah's voice cracked on the words, her composure finally beginning to crumble under the weight of consequences she'd never considered. I would never hurt my mother financially. Everything we discussed was about protecting her assets and making sure she receives proper care. Dr. Williams opened her folder with clinical precision, her medical training evident in the methodical way she presented evidence that would demolish Sarah's claims about my declining competency. Sarah, I've been your mother's physician for 15 years. Her most recent comprehensive evaluation shows cognitive function in the 95th percentile for her age group, excellent physical health, and no medical conditions that would impair her judgment or decision-making ability. The medical documentation passed between David and Detective Ruiz like evidence in a courtroom, each page representing another nail in the coffin of Sarah's guardianship fantasies. I watched my daughter's face as she began to understand that her assumptions about my declining capacity had been not just wrong, but potentially criminally wrong. Furthermore, Dr. Williams continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when delivering serious diagnoses. Your mother's living situation, community involvement, and daily activities represent optimal aging practices that support both physical and mental health. Institutionalizing someone with her capabilities and community connections would constitute medical malpractice if I were to recommend it. Father Rodriguez added his voice to the growing chorus of testimony that painted Sarah's plans as not just misguided but actively harmful to my well-being. Sarah, your mother coordinates our immigrant literacy program, manages a scholarship fund that has helped dozens of students pursue higher education, and serves as a mentor to elderly community members struggling with isolation and depression. Her contributions to our parish and our broader community are immeasurable. Each piece of testimony stripped away another layer of Sarah's justification for her plans, revealing the hollowness of her claims about my incompetency and the selfishness underlying her concern for my welfare. I could see her struggling to process the gap between her perception of my capabilities and the reality being presented by professionals who interacted with me regularly. But it was David's next revelation that delivered the killing blow to any remaining illusion that Sarah's plans were motivated by genuine concern rather than greed disguised as caregiving. Sarah, we need to discuss your knowledge of your mother's actual financial situation, David said, opening a folder that contained documentation of assets Sarah had never known existed. Because it appears your plans were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the resources available for your mother's care. David spread financial statements across the coffee table like a poker player revealing a winning hand, each document representing another aspect of the wealth Eduardo and I had built over decades of careful investment and business expansion. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in numbers that were clearly far larger than anything she'd anticipated. "Your mother owns property worth approximately $2.5 million, David continued methodically, including the restaurant building, this house, a 4-unit apartment complex, and 2 commercial properties in rapidly appreciating neighborhoods. Her investment accounts, managed by a reputable financial advisor, contain another $700,000 in diversified holdings that have consistently outperformed market averages." The numbers hung in the air like accusations, each figure representing Sarah's ignorance about the very assets she'd been planning to liquidate and control. Michael's business mind was clearly calculating the implications, realizing that they'd been plotting to manage wealth that dwarfed their own household income. Additionally, David said, delivering the final devastating blow, "Your mother and father established a charitable foundation 8 years ago that has been quietly funding scholarships and community programs. That foundation currently holds assets worth approximately $400,000, all of which has been managed responsibly under your mother's oversight since your father's death." Sarah sank into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her, the magnitude of her miscalculation becoming clear as she realized she'd been planning to institutionalize a woman with the financial resources to buy Sarah's own house without straining her budget. "But I thought," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as her worldview crumbled around her, "I thought you were just comfortable, maybe had enough saved for basic care. I didn't know about any of this other property or these investment accounts." "That's because you never asked," I said, my voice carrying the disappointed authority of a mother who had watched her child reveal character flaws that couldn't be excused by ignorance or good intentions. "You never showed interest in understanding what your father and I built together. You never wanted to learn about the business decisions that created the wealth you were planning to liquidate." Detective Ruiz spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the professional neutrality of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by greed masquerading as concern. "Sarah, attempting to gain control over someone else's assets through false claims of incompetency constitutes financial exploitation under Colorado law. The penalty for elder financial abuse can include substantial fines and imprisonment." The mention of imprisonment caused Michael to step forward, his businessman's instincts finally overriding his loyalty to his wife's plans as he recognized the criminal liability they'd unknowingly created. "Detective, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Michael said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to negotiate his way out of serious legal trouble. "We were genuinely concerned about Maria's welfare. We weren't trying to steal anything or harm her in any way." Father Rodriguez's response carried the moral weight of someone who had counseled families through similar crises, his disappointment evident as he addressed the man who had sat in his pews during family celebrations while apparently planning to betray the woman who had helped raise his children. "Michael, good intentions don't excuse the harm caused by actions taken without consent or understanding," Father Rodriguez said gently but firmly. "Maria has been managing her affairs responsibly for decades. Your plans to override her autonomy would have caused immeasurable damage to her well-being and her connection to the community that gives her life meaning." Sarah looked up from her hands, tears streaming down her face, as the full scope of her betrayal became clear not just to the assembled witnesses but to herself. The successful businesswoman who had built her career on analysis and strategic thinking was being forced to confront the possibility that her judgment about her own mother had been catastrophically wrong. "Mom, I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine remorse. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought you were becoming confused, making decisions that could put you at risk. I didn't realize you were still managing everything so well." The apology hung in the air like a fragile bridge across the chasm that had opened between us, offering the possibility of reconciliation while acknowledging the damage that had already been done to our relationship. But Detective Ruiz's next words reminded everyone that some actions have consequences that go beyond family forgiveness, that criminal behavior requires legal resolution regardless of the emotional dynamics between the people involved. "The question now," Detective Ruiz said, her voice maintaining professional neutrality, is whether Mrs. Rodriguez chooses to pursue criminal charges for attempted financial exploitation, or whether this can be resolved through family agreements that ensure her continued autonomy and protection. The choice she presented forced me to confront the decision I'd been avoiding since discovering Sarah's plans. Did I want justice that might send my daughter to prison, or mercy that might allow our relationship to heal while ensuring my continued independence? I looked around the room at the people who had rallied to protect me, seeing not just professional allies but genuine friends who had proven their loyalty when it mattered most. David's legal expertise, Dr. Williams' medical advocacy, Father Rodriguez's moral support, Detective Ruiz's official protection, all representing the community I'd built over 6 decades of treating others with respect and dignity. Then I looked at Sarah, seeing not the calculating woman who had called me a burden, but the little girl who had once helped me roll masa for tortillas, who had cried when her goldfish died, who had called me her best friend during the years when other children's cruelty made her doubt her own worth. The decision I made in that moment would define not just the remainder of my life, but the legacy Eduardo and I would leave for future generations of our family. It would determine whether love was stronger than betrayal, whether forgiveness was possible after fundamental trust had been shattered, whether the values we'd tried to instill in Sarah could still take root, despite the selfish choices she'd been prepared to make. "Sarah," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of experience with hard choices and their consequences, "you have one opportunity to choose who you want to be for the rest of your life. The daughter who tried to steal her mother's independence for financial convenience, or the woman who takes responsibility for her mistakes and works to earn back the trust she destroyed." The silence that followed would determine whether our family could survive the crisis Sarah had created, or whether the bonds Eduardo and I had tried to build across generations had been permanently severed by greed and the casual cruelty of someone who had forgotten that love requires respect for the people we claim to protect. Sarah's transformation began with tears that seemed to wash away years of accumulated selfishness and misplaced priorities, her successful businesswoman facade cracking to reveal the confused and frightened woman underneath who had lost sight of the values Eduardo and I had tried to teach her. She sat in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of her attempted betrayal, and for the first time in years I saw glimpses of the child who had once trusted me to make everything right in her world. "Mom, I don't know how I became someone who could even think about taking away your independence," Sarah said, her voice raw with genuine remorse. "Somewhere along the way, I started seeing you as a problem to be managed, instead of the woman who sacrificed everything to give me opportunities you never had." The honesty in her confession marked the beginning of a conversation that should have happened years ago, a reckoning with the distance that had grown between us as Sarah's professional success pulled her further away from the community values that had shaped her childhood. Michael sat beside her, his own shame evident as he realized how his business-focused mindset had supported plans that reduced a family member to a financial calculation. Detective Ruiz listened carefully as Sarah detailed the thought process that had led to her attempted guardianship scheme, taking notes that would determine whether criminal charges were warranted or whether this could be resolved through family accountability and legal protections. The fact that Sarah was voluntarily confessing to her intentions, without legal counsel pressuring her to minimize her culpability, carried weight in the detective's assessment of whether she posed an ongoing threat to my welfare. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Detective Ruiz said, addressing me directly, "based on what I've heard today, I believe your daughter's actions stemmed from misguided concern rather than malicious intent to defraud you. However, the impact of her plans would have been the same regardless of her motivations. The decision about whether to pursue charges ultimately rests with you." The choice felt like standing at a crossroads between justice and mercy, between protecting myself from future betrayal and preserving whatever remained of the family Eduardo and I had tried to build together. I thought about Eduardo's voice during our most difficult parenting decisions, his belief that love sometimes required consequences, while always leaving room for redemption. "I don't want criminal charges," I said finally, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to make this choice. "But I want legal guarantees that my autonomy will be protected, that my assets will remain under my control, and that any future concerns about my welfare will be addressed through direct conversation with me, rather than behind-the-scenes plotting." David Martinez immediately began outlining the legal framework that would ensure my continued independence while addressing any legitimate concerns about my future care needs. Advanced directives that clearly specified my preferences for medical treatment and living arrangements. Durable powers of attorney that I controlled and could revoke at any time. Trust structures that would protect my assets while allowing me to maintain complete decision-making authority during my lifetime. But more importantly, David proposed a family agreement that would require Sarah and Michael to undergo counseling about elder care, financial ethics, and family communication before any discussion of my future needs could take place. They would need to demonstrate understanding of my capabilities, respect for my autonomy, and commitment to supporting my choices rather than overriding them. Over the following months, I watched Sarah struggle with the reality of who she had almost become. The successful professional who had nearly destroyed her relationship with the woman who had made her achievements possible. The counseling sessions were painful for all of us, forcing conversations about expectations, assumptions, and the ways financial success had distorted Sarah's perspective on family obligations. Michael proved more receptive to changing his approach, perhaps because his business background helped him understand the legal and financial implications of what they had attempted. He began asking genuine questions about my investment strategies, my property management decisions, and the community programs I supported, showing respect for knowledge he had previously dismissed as outdated thinking. Sarah's transformation took longer and required deeper soul-searching about the person she had become during her climb up the corporate ladder. She had to confront the uncomfortable reality that she had learned to see elderly people, including her own mother, as burdens to be managed, rather than individuals deserving dignity and respect. The turning point came 6 months after our confrontation, when Sarah volunteered to help with my literacy program at the senior center. Working directly with elderly immigrants who were struggling to learn English, she began to understand the strength, wisdom, and continued potential that she had dismissed as confusion and decline in her own mother. "Mom, Mrs. Herrera just told me she's 79 years old and learning to read English so she can help her great-granddaughter with homework," Sarah said after her first volunteer session, her voice filled with wonder at discovering capabilities she had assumed didn't exist in people of advanced age. "She's sharper than half the junior executives at my firm." The experience opened Sarah's eyes to her own ageism, the unconscious biases that had made her assume incompetence based on birth year rather than actual ability. She began to see my community involvement not as dangerous overextension but as the meaningful engagement that kept my mind sharp and my spirit strong. A year after the confrontation that had nearly destroyed our family, Sarah made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She took early retirement from her consulting firm, using her business skills to help expand the Rodriguez Family Foundation into a comprehensive resource for elderly community members who needed support navigating healthcare, housing, and financial decisions. "I want to spend the rest of my career helping families avoid the mistakes I almost made," Sarah told me during one of our monthly foundation planning meetings. "I want to teach people that aging doesn't mean becoming incompetent, that elderly family members deserve respect and autonomy, not management and institutionalization." The foundation grew under Sarah's leadership, becoming a model for community-based elder support that preserved independence while providing genuine assistance. We developed programs that helped elderly people understand their legal rights, access appropriate medical care, and maintain their homes and communities as long as possible. But perhaps most importantly, we created educational resources for adult children who were struggling with their own parents' aging, helping them distinguish between genuine care needs and their own convenience, between protection and control, between love and enablement. Emma and Sophia, now in college, chose to write their senior sociology projects about ageism and elder abuse, interviewing their grandmother about her experiences and learning family history they had previously ignored. The girls who had once sat in my living room, scrolling through their phones during family dinners, became advocates for elder rights and intergenerational respect. The restaurant continued to thrive under Rosa's management, serving as a gathering place for 3 generations of families, while generating income that supported the foundation's expanding programs. The building that Sarah had once wanted to liquidate for development became the headquarters for services that kept hundreds of elderly community members living independently in their own homes. My house remained my sanctuary, the place where Eduardo's presence still guided my daily decisions, and where family traditions continued to connect past and future. The dining room, where Sarah had called me a burden, became the place where we planned foundation programs that would protect other families from the crisis we had survived. Dr. Williams continued to document my excellent health and mental acuity, her records serving as proof that aging doesn't necessarily mean declining, that 78 can be a time of continued growth and contribution rather than managed deterioration. On the second anniversary of our confrontation, as I sat in my kitchen preparing Eduardo's favorite mole recipe for our family dinner, I reflected on the journey that had taken us from betrayal to understanding, from crisis to purpose. Sarah entered the kitchen carrying flowers from my garden, the same garden she had once seen as a maintenance burden, but now understood as a source of beauty and peace that enhanced rather than complicated my life. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Sarah said, her voice carrying the directness she had learned during months of counseling and soul-searching. "I'm grateful you stopped me from destroying both of our lives. I'm grateful you chose mercy over justice, growth over punishment, hope over despair." The words represented a healing I had hardly dared to hope for during those dark months, when I wondered whether our family could survive the damage Sarah's plans had caused. Eduardo's legacy lived not just in the foundation that bore our name, but in the restored relationship that proved love could be stronger than betrayal when people were willing to do the hard work of change. As we gathered around the dinner table that evening, 3 generations sharing stories and planning future projects that would serve our community, I felt Eduardo's approval surrounding us like a blessing. The family he had helped create was stronger for having survived its greatest test, wiser for having learned that independence and interdependence could coexist, that aging could mean continued growth rather than inevitable decline. The woman Sarah had once called a burden had become the foundation for programs that supported hundreds of elderly people in maintaining their dignity and autonomy. The assets she had wanted to liquidate had been transformed into resources that strengthened families and communities across Denver. Most importantly, the daughter who had almost destroyed our relationship through misguided concern had learned to see aging as an opportunity for continued contribution rather than a problem requiring management. Our family had been transformed from a source of shame into a model for what was possible when people chose respect over control, understanding over assumption, love over convenience. Eduardo's dream of a legacy that would strengthen communities for generations had been fulfilled in ways neither of us could have imagined, carried forward by the daughter who had almost destroyed it but chose instead to become its most passionate advocate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.